The ranger who found her said he had never seen anything like it in 31 years of working Yellowstone. He had been following a report of an elderly woman entering the backcountry through the Lamar Valley trailhead 3 days earlier, alone, on foot, carrying an oxygen tank. The search had been expanding in concentric circles. They expected to find a body. The math was brutal. An 82-year-old woman with stage 4 lung cancer, in late October, in the northern range of Yellowstone, without a tent, without proper gear, without telling anyone where she was going. 3 days. Temperatures dropping to 18 degrees at night. They expected to find a body, and they had made their peace with that before they went looking. What Ranger Dale Hutchins found instead was Margaret Sullivan sitting peacefully against a ponderosa pine, her orange oxygen tank beside her walking stick resting across her knees, her white hair loose around her shoulders. She was alive. Her eyes were closed, but there was color in her cheeks, and when he called her name she turned her head and smiled at him with the serenity of someone who had finished every piece of important business they had in this world. Beside her, touching her at the hip, curled against her with his enormous gray head resting across her lap, was a wolf. The largest, oldest-looking wolf Dale Hutchins had ever seen in 3 decades of working this park. Gray-muzzled, thin with age, his once thick coat reduced to something sparse and silver. His eyes were closed too. His breathing was shallow and slow. Dale stopped walking. He stood absolutely still. He looked at this woman and this wolf, side by side against a tree in the cold morning light, and he understood without anyone needing to explain it that he was witnessing something that did not belong to him. Something that had been arranged long before he arrived, between two creatures who had found each other across 25 years and 300 miles and the uncrossable distance between the wild world and the human one. He stood at a distance. He radioed for backup in a whisper. He waited. Margaret Sullivan died at 9:14 that morning, October 23, 2023, with her hand resting on the wolf's silver back. The wolf died 40 minutes later. He did not lift his head. He simply stopped breathing. The park biologist who examined him estimated his age at somewhere between 25 and 27 years. The oldest documented wild wolf in Yellowstone history. The oldest documented wild wolf in North America. This is the story of how they found each other the first time. And how, after 25 years, they found each other again. To understand what Margaret Sullivan was doing in Yellowstone on that October morning, you need to go back to the spring of 1998, when she was 57 years old and newly retired and driving across Montana because she had no idea what else to do with herself. She had spent 31 years as a high school biology teacher in Billings. She had raised 2 children, a son named Robert, who became an accountant in Denver, and a daughter named Claire, who became a nurse in Portland. She had been married for 34 years to a man named Thomas, a quiet and decent man who died of a heart attack in 1996 while raking leaves in their backyard. She had found him face down in the leaves and called 911 and ridden in the ambulance and sat in a waiting room for 4 hours before a doctor came through the door with a particular expression on his face, and she had understood that expression before he said a single word. 2 years after Thomas died, she retired from teaching because she could no longer summon the energy to stand in front of 30 teenagers and explain the mechanisms of cellular respiration with the enthusiasm those mechanisms deserved. She sold the house in Billings because every room in it had a memory with a specific face and a specific voice, and she could not cook dinner in her kitchen without hearing Thomas humming off-key the way he always had. She bought a small truck and started driving. She was not running away. She was simply moving, because movement felt more honest than pretending she was living a normal life in a normal house where everything was fine. She had been driving for 3 weeks when she found the wolf. It was the first week of May, just east of the Beartooth Highway, in a section of national forest where the snow had receded enough to reveal the muddy ground beneath. Margaret had pulled over to look at a red-tailed hawk perched on a fence post, because old habits from 31 years of biology teaching die hard, and she had her binoculars around her neck as she always did. She saw movement at the base of a drainage ditch about 40 yards off the road. Small movement, inconsistent with the wind. She watched it for 90 seconds before she climbed the fence. The pup was small enough to hold in both hands. 3 months old, she would learn later, though at the time she estimated 2. Dark gray, with a white marking on his chest, an irregular patch shaped roughly like a hand. If you used your imagination, the fingers pointing upward toward his throat. He was alone and he was dying. His eyes were crusted with mucus. His ribs pressed visibly against his skin. He was making no sound at all, which was the most alarming thing, because animals that have stopped making noise have usually stopped hoping. Margaret was a biology teacher. She knew what a wolf pup looked like. She also knew that you were not supposed to touch them, that wildlife belonged to the wild, that intervention in natural processes was something to be resisted except under extraordinary circumstances. She picked him up anyway. He weighed less than a bag of flour. His tiny heart beat against her palm like something fragile and furious and determined not to stop. "All right," she said out loud, to him, to herself, to the empty Montana sky. "Let's see what we can do." If you believe there are moments in life when the universe reaches down and hands you exactly the thing you need, in exactly the form you least expected, then you already understand what happened to Margaret Sullivan on that roadside in Montana. Subscribe to Feral Soul Stories and join a community of people who believe in the power of the bonds this world offers us when we're paying attention. What she did next was practical and immediate and slightly illegal. She wrapped him in her jacket and put him on the passenger seat floor and drove to the nearest town, which turned out to be a community of 400 people called Roscoe, which had exactly one veterinarian, a large animal vet named Dr. Kevin Marsh, who dealt primarily in horses and cattle and who looked at Margaret and her bundle with the expression of a man whose Tuesday had just taken an unexpected turn. "That's a wolf pup," he said. "I know that," Margaret said. "You can't just pick up a wolf pup. They're a protected species." He was dying in a ditch. Kevin Marsh looked at the pup for a long moment. He was a practical man, not a sentimental one. But he was also someone who had spent 22 years keeping things alive for a living, and something in him responded involuntarily to the faint flutter of a heartbeat that was still going despite everything working against it. "Put him on the table," he said. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and fighting a respiratory infection that, Kevin told her, would have killed him within another 24 hours in the condition he was in. He administered 4 fluids through a needle so small Margaret had to squint to see it. He gave antibiotics. He showed Margaret how to prepare a formula, goat's milk, egg yolk, a specific mix of supplements, and how to feed it through a bottle with a modified nipple. He told her, clearly and firmly, that as soon as the pup was stable she needed to contact Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and surrender the animal to a licensed rehabilitation facility. "I understand," Margaret said. She drove to the nearest motel, a 12-unit building called the Beartooth Rest, and she spent the next 11 days in room 7. She fed the pup every 3 hours, through the day and through the night, setting alarms on her watch. She slept in 90-minute increments, woke, heated the formula, coaxed the bottle between his lips, watched his throat move as he swallowed, wrote down in a small notebook the time and the amount consumed. She had kept meticulous attendance records for 31 years of teaching. She applied the same discipline now. On the 3rd day, the pup's eyes cleared. He began to look at her, actually look at her, not through her, with eyes the color of pale gold in the lamplight. On the 5th day, he stood up for the first time, staggered immediately, sat back down, and regarded the floor with the expression of something reconsidering its options. On the 7th day, he ate from a bowl rather than a bottle, his little face buried in the formula with a focus that suggested he had decided, firmly and finally, to survive. She called him Ghost. The white patch on his chest, in the room's inadequate lighting, sometimes seemed to glow slightly, the way snow glows at dusk. It seemed to suit him. She called Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks on the 8th day. She spoke to a woman named Carol who was professional and direct and told her what she had already known, that Ghost needed to be transferred to a rehabilitation facility, that he was too young to survive in the wild without an established pack, that the Northern Rockies Wildlife Center in Missoula was best equipped to handle his reintegration, that Margaret had done something remarkable in keeping him alive, and that the right thing now was to let professionals continue the work. Margaret listened to all of this. She said she understood. She set a date for the transfer, 3 days away. In those 3 days, something happened that she would spend 25 years thinking about. Ghost began to follow her. Not to follow her for the bottle, though the bottle remained important to him, but to follow her the way young things follow the creature that has become the center of their world. Across the room, to the door, back to the bed. He would sit beside her feet when she ate her own meals. He would press himself against her leg when the motel's heating system made a loud noise. At night, she would wake in the darkness and feel him tucked against her side, his small body radiating surprising warmth, his breathing deep and even in sleep. On the final evening, she sat on the edge of the bed with him in her lap. He was awake, looking up at her with those pale gold eyes, his white-patched chest rising and falling steadily. She traced the marking with her finger, the shape of it, the way the white fur lay differently than the gray, finer, almost soft in a different way. "I have to take you somewhere tomorrow," she told him. "Somewhere better for you than this motel room. Somewhere you can learn what you're supposed to learn." He watched her while she talked. She had taught teenagers for 31 years. She knew the particular quality of attention you got when someone was genuinely listening, and she had learned to value it above almost everything else. "But I'm going to make you a promise," she said. "I know you won't remember it. I know you're an animal and this is just biology and I'm a lonely old woman talking to a wolf pup in a motel room in Montana. But I'm going to say it anyway because I mean it." She paused. Ghost's tail moved slightly, twice, against her leg. "I'll come back," she said, "before one of us dies. I'll find you and I'll come back." She transferred him the following morning to a transport carrier sent from the Northern Rockies Wildlife Center. She watched the van until it turned onto the highway and disappeared. Then she sat in her truck in the parking lot of the Beartooth Rest for 45 minutes, not crying exactly, but not quite not crying either, before she started the engine and drove away. Life has a way of taking the promises you make in quiet rooms and burying them under the accumulated weight of ordinary time. Margaret didn't go home to a quiet life. She went back to Billings and discovered that her son Robert's marriage was falling apart, that he needed help with his 2 young children while he and his wife figured out what was left of their relationship. She went to Denver. She stayed 6 months. She moved in with Claire in Portland for a while after that, because Claire had been carrying something heavy since her father died and finally couldn't carry it alone. Margaret stayed a year. She tried to keep track of Ghost. She called the Northern Rockies Wildlife Center twice in 1999 and was told, gently, that they couldn't share detailed information about individual animals for privacy reasons. Privacy, she thought, applied to wolves now, which was a development that would have struck her as funny if she'd been in a mood to find things funny. She wrote a letter. She received a form response thanking her for her concern and assuring her that their work was supported by donations. In 2000, the federal government reinstated wolf populations in Yellowstone National Park as part of a reintroduction program that Margaret followed closely in the newspapers. She read every article. She knew the wolves were being brought from Canada, not from Montana rehabilitation centers, but she read the articles anyway, because reading about wolves felt like the closest she could get. In 2003, her daughter Claire was diagnosed with breast cancer. Early stage, survivable, but requiring surgery and chemotherapy and 18 months of appointments and fear and the particular exhaustion of watching someone you love fight something you cannot fight for them. Margaret was there for all of it. In 2006, Robert's divorce finalized and he moved back to Billings with the children, and Margaret found herself doing something she hadn't expected at this stage of her life, helping raise her grandchildren. She picked up Emma and James from school 3 days a week. She went to school plays and soccer games and science fairs. She taught Emma how to identify birds by their calls. She taught James about the water cycle using a kitchen pot and a glass lid. She was, in these years, genuinely busy and genuinely needed and genuinely happy in a way she hadn't been since before Thomas died. She thought about Ghost. Of course she thought about Ghost. But thinking about a promise is different from keeping it, and the years moved in the way years do when you're living a full life, fast from the outside, slow from the inside, and somehow always insufficient. In 2011, she was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. In 2015, a mild heart attack that the doctors called a warning. In 2019, the lung cancer diagnosis, delivered by a pulmonologist named Dr. Rivera, who was kind and precise and who told her that at her age, with her other conditions, they would focus on quality of life rather than aggressive treatment. She moved to a hospice care facility in Billings in early 2023. Her room had a window that looked out at the Rim Rocks, those ancient sandstone formations above the city that had watched over Billings since before there was a Billings to watch over. She had a television she rarely turned on. She had her grandchildren's drawings taped above her bed. She had a shelf with photographs, Thomas and the children, Claire on her wedding day, Robert with his kids, Margaret herself at 35 in front of a chalkboard with an expression of complete absorption in whatever she had just written. She slept a great deal. She read when she had the energy. She talked with the night nurse, a young man named Devante who was studying for his EMT certification and who asked her questions about her life with genuine curiosity, the kind that couldn't be faked. She had made her peace with what was coming. She had done the accounting of her life as honestly as she could. She had been a good teacher, a decent mother, a loyal wife. She had, she believed, caused more healing than harm in the 82 years she had been given. But there was one thing left undone. She knew it the way you know the one drawer in the house that was never properly organized, the one conversation you kept meaning to have, the one thing you had been carrying without quite acknowledging the weight of it. She had made a promise to a wolf in a motel room in Montana in 1998. She had never kept it. It was the 14th of September 2023, at 11:18 in the evening, when Margaret Sullivan woke from a doze in the hospice chair to find the television still running from the documentary Devante had put on before his rounds. The program was about Yellowstone. She had seen dozens of documentaries about Yellowstone. The park had been a constant of her imagination since childhood, since her own biology teacher had shown slides of the thermal basins and the great herds and called it the last piece of the old world. She was about to reach for the remote when the narrator said something that made her hands stop. In the northern range, the narrator said, over footage of a ridgeline in autumn gold, researchers have documented what may be the most remarkable individual in the park's wolf population. A gray male, designation YNP21M, estimated to be somewhere between 24 and 26 years of age, making him almost certainly the oldest wild wolf ever documented in North America. The typical lifespan for a wild wolf is 6 to 8 years. This animal has defied every actuarial table in the scientific literature. The camera found him. A gray wolf on a hillside, moving slowly, his joints stiff in the way of very old things, his muzzle white as winter. He was thin but not starved. There was still something in the way he carried himself, something deliberate, unhurried, not diminished. The camera zoomed. The focus sharpened. And Margaret Sullivan sat straight up in her hospice chair and pressed both hands over her mouth. On the wolf's chest, visible even through the camera at that distance, was a white marking. Irregular, roughly the shape of an upraised hand, the fingers pointing toward his throat. She had traced it with her finger 25 years ago in a motel room in Montana. She would have known it in her sleep. Ghost, she whispered. The name she had given him. The name no one else knew. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and listened to her oxygen concentrator and watched the ceiling and thought about a motel room and a pup who weighed less than a bag of flour and a promise she had made and meant and then, through no deliberate decision, had simply not kept. She was 82. She had lung cancer. Her doctors had told her, somewhere between 3 and 6 months. And ghost. Her ghost, if it was him, and she knew with a certainty that needed no scientific verification that it was him, was somewhere in the Lamar Valley of Yellowstone, at the end of his own impossibly extended life, waiting in the way wild things wait. Without language, without calendars, without hope in the human sense, but waiting nonetheless. She lay in the dark and she made her accounting. She could stay in this bed and die in this room with the rim rocks outside her window and the children's drawings above her head and everything comfortable and arranged and sensible. She could honor her family's worry and her doctor's instructions and the reasonable consensus of everyone who loved her. Or she could get up. If this story is teaching you what it's teaching me, that some promises matter more than safety, that some debts of the heart cannot be deferred indefinitely, then you belong here at Feral Soul Stories. Hit subscribe and join a community that believes the extraordinary things are sometimes the most necessary ones. She told no one. Or rather, she told Devante the night nurse. because Devante was the only person she trusted to listen without immediately calling her daughter. It was 2 in the morning. She had been awake for nearly 3 hours. She told him about Ghost, the motel room, the promise, the documentary, all of it. Devante was 24 years old. He was studying to be an emergency medical technician. He was, by any rational measure, the last person who should have been complicit in what she was planning. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. "My grandmother," he said finally, drove herself to her hometown in Louisiana when she was 79, against doctor's orders, because she needed to see the house she grew up in one more time before she couldn't anymore. "We were furious with her." He paused. "She died in that house, in the room she was born in, 3 weeks later. I've never once wished she hadn't gone." He looked at Margaret. She looked at him. "I need a map of Yellowstone and the Northern Range wolf territory," she said. "And I need someone to fill my spare oxygen tank without logging it as a non-routine request." Devante was quiet for another moment. "I can't officially help you with this. I know. What you're describing is dangerous. Seriously dangerous. Your pulmonary function alone." "I know," she said again. He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze the way she had held the gaze of teenagers for 31 years, steady and clear and not asking permission, just asking honesty. "The night staff does a round at 4 a.m., he said finally. "After that, there's a gap of about 40 minutes before the day shift starts coming in. The back entrance near the garden is on a different camera circuit from the parking lot." She reached across and put her hand on his. "You're going to be a wonderful EMT. You're going to get yourself killed, Mrs. Sullivan." "Maybe," she said, "but I'll have kept my promise." She left at 4:52 in the morning on October 20th, 2023. She had packed a canvas bag, 2 full oxygen tanks, her medications, a thermos of hot tea, 2 granola bars, a folded map of Yellowstone's northern range, and a photograph she had kept for 25 years, Ghost as a pup, curled in her jacket in the passenger seat of her truck, taken with the disposable camera she had bought at a gas station in Roscoe. In the photograph his eyes were closed and the white patch on his chest was visible, and he looked, against all the evidence of what he had been when she found him, utterly peaceful. Her car was in the hospice parking lot. She had not driven it in 4 months, and the battery needed a jump from a set of cables she had in the trunk, which took 11 minutes and a certain amount of language that the hospice walls had probably never heard before. She was breathing harder than she would have liked when she finally got the engine running. She sat for a moment. The parking lot was empty. The sky was deep indigo, not yet touched by the first gray of morning. The rim rocks above the city were dark shapes against slightly less dark sky. "Thomas," she said out loud, to her husband who had been dead for 27 years. "I'm going to do something either very right or very stupid. Probably both. Try to keep up." She put the car in drive. The trip from Billings to Yellowstone's Lamar Valley runs approximately 300 miles, northwest on Interstate 90 and then south through the Absaroka Range and into the park. Under normal circumstances it takes about 5.5 hours. Margaret drove slowly, keeping to the right lane, stopping twice at rest areas to adjust her oxygen flow and rest her hands, which ached with arthritis in the cold. She stopped once at a gas station outside Livingston, Montana, where a teenage boy in a puffy vest filled her tank without making eye contact, and where she bought a second thermos of coffee and a package of crackers and ate half of them sitting in the car in the parking lot, watching a flock of Canada geese moving across a gray November sky. She arrived at the northeast entrance of Yellowstone at 11:38 in the morning. The park was largely empty this late in the season, most of the summer visitors long gone, the first serious snowfall still a week or 2 away. The entrance attendant, a young woman with a sunburned nose who seemed mildly surprised to see a solo elderly driver arriving in mid-October, waved her through with her senior pass. She drove to the Lamar Valley slowly, the road winding through country that opened up gradually, the mountains pulling back to reveal the wide flat grassland of the valley floor. She had been to Yellowstone once before, decades ago, a family trip when Robert and Claire were young, but she had not been in the North Range. She had not been to the wolf country. She stopped at a pullout overlooking the valley and got out of the car. The cold was immediate and total, probably 28 degrees, she estimated, with a wind off the mountains that made it feel colder. She put her jacket on. She adjusted her oxygen tank's carry strap across her shoulder. She found her walking stick, the old one with the rubber tip that she had used since her hip operation in 2018. She stood at the pullout and looked at the valley. The Lamar River was a dark line through the pale grass. Across the river, hills rose toward mountains still covered in last week's snow. A small group of bison moved in the middle distance, slow and purposeful. She opened the map. She found the area designated as the primary winter range for the northern pack. She looked at the terrain and made some calculations based on 82 years of moving through the world and knowing roughly what her body could and could not manage. She started walking. What Margaret Sullivan did over the next 3 days is not entirely documented, because she was alone for most of it and because the account she gave to the ranger who found her was fragmentary. She had been awake for long stretches, and the cold and the altitude and the reduced oxygen of high exertion had affected her cognition in ways she herself acknowledged. What is known? She walked into the backcountry through the Lamar Valley trailhead, covering approximately 4 miles on the first day before stopping to rest in a hollow at the base of a ridge. She wrapped herself in the emergency blanket she had thought to bring, and she slept, and she was cold but not dangerously so. She drank from her thermos. She watched the stars come out over Wyoming and identified Orion and Cassiopeia by name, out of habit, because she had been identifying stars for 82 years and was not about to stop. On the second day, she saw the tracks. Large, deep-set, slightly dragging in the way of an animal that was old and had been old for a long time. Moving parallel to the ridgeline. She followed them. She told Ranger Hutchins, when he found her, that she had not been frightened. She said this clearly and without any of the soft retrospective revision people sometimes apply to frightening experiences. She said she had not been frightened because she had come specifically to find what she was following, and fear requires a component of unwanted surprise, and she had not been surprised. She had been, she said, relieved. On the second evening, she built a small fire from dead wood. She had been a biology teacher and an outdoor person her whole life and knew how to build a fire, and she sat beside it and she talked. Not to the darkness exactly. To Ghost. The way she had talked to him in the motel room. The way she talked to Thomas, to the night sky, to whatever it was she had always believed was worth talking to even when there was no visible evidence of it listening. She told him about the years. Robert's children and Claire's recovery and the grandchildren growing up and Thomas and the house in Billings. She told him about the hospice room and the documentary and sitting up in the dark at 11:18 in the evening watching the camera find his face. She told him she had been a long time keeping this promise and that she was sorry for that and that she hoped wherever he was he had lived well in the years between. On the morning of the third day, she woke to find fresh tracks in the frost around her camp. Circling. Pausing. Moving away. She smiled. She sat up slowly, her joints protesting the cold, and she adjusted her oxygen and she drank the last of her tea. She looked at the tracks. She looked at the direction they moved off in, northeast, toward a stand of ponderosa pine on a gentle rise. She got up. She walked. She found the hollow at the base of the ponderosa around 8 in the morning. It was sheltered from the wind, south-facing, warming in the early light. She sat down against the tree with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and exactly why. She waited. He came at 8:47. She heard him before she saw him, the soft displacement of frost, the particular silence that precedes the presence of a predator, the way the birds stilled. Then he stepped from behind the largest tree and stood 12 feet away and looked at her. He was old. God, he was old. She could see it in every line of him, in the white muzzle and the clouded eyes and the way his spine curved slightly with the weight of his years. He weighed maybe 70 pounds. A wolf his age and size should have weighed 110. He had burned through every reserve, sustained himself on whatever the territory still offered to an animal too old to hunt the way he once had. But he was alive. He was standing. And on his chest, against the gray of his aged coat, the white patch was still visible, still shaped the way it had always been, the irregular hand with its fingers pointing upward, exactly the way she remembered tracing it in the lamplight of a motel room when he weighed less than a bag of flour. She did not move. She did not make a sound. He stood for a long time, perfectly still, looking at her. The way wolves look, not the flat stare of something deciding whether you're prey, but the measuring, intelligent, specific attention of an animal trying to determine something complicated. Then he took a step. Then another. He was beside her in less than a minute, his old legs lowering him to the ground in stages, the way very old dogs settle, with more deliberateness than grace. He put his head across her lap. His eyes closed. She put her hand on his chest. Over the white marking. She felt the slow movement of his breathing. She felt, faint and steady, his heart. "I told you I'd come back," she said. "I always meant to." He made a sound, low in his throat, not quite a whimper, not quite anything else. A sound of settling, of completion. They sat together in the morning light and the wind moved through the ponderosis above them, and somewhere in the valley a raven called once and was not answered. Ranger Dale Hutchins found them at 9 a.m. He radioed in almost immediately, his voice controlled but with something underneath it that the other rangers would talk about for months. A quality of awe, of disruption, as if what he was looking at had briefly reorganized something in his understanding of the world. He waited at a distance. He called for backup and for a park biologist. He watched. Margaret Sullivan was still breathing when he arrived. She appeared to be asleep, her white hair loose around her shoulders, her hand resting on the wolf's back. Her oxygen was still flowing. The tank had perhaps another 2 hours in it. Her color was good. She was smiling very slightly, with the particular quality of expression that belongs to someone who has finished everything they needed to finish. He watched her breathing slow. At 9:14 a.m. it stopped. He called it in. He stood where he was. The wolf did not raise his head. He remained motionless against her for another 40 minutes. The biologist arrived and stood beside Hutchins and neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would not diminish what they were witnessing. At 9:54 a.m. the wolf's breathing stopped. The biologist, Dr. Sandra Reeves, who had been tracking wolves in Yellowstone for 18 years, wrote in her report that she had no scientific framework for what she had witnessed. She noted the wolf's estimated age, the confirmed identification of the white chest marking through cross-reference with a photograph obtained from the Sullivan family, and the fact that the wolf had come to the specific location where Margaret Sullivan was sitting rather than the other way around. She noted these things clearly and factually and then added one sentence that was not, strictly speaking, scientific. She wrote, "He was waiting for her." Margaret Sullivan's family was informed of her absence from the hospice at 6:20 in the morning on October 20th, when the day shift began and Devante, who had sat up all night in increasing anguish, watching the clock, could no longer keep the secret in good conscience. Claire flew in from Portland. Robert drove from Denver. They had 3 days of the particular terror that is the space between someone being missing and someone being found. When they received the Rangers' call on the morning of October 23rd, they were told that Margaret had been found, that she had died peacefully, that she had not been alone. It took Robert a long time to understand the last part. Claire understood it immediately. Claire had known her mother longer and differently, had seen the careful life she had built after Thomas died, had understood the particular cost of loss to someone who loved with Margaret's completeness. She called Robert back. "She kept her promise," Claire said. Robert was quiet for a moment. "What promise?" "The one she made in 1998. The one she told me about when Dad died, when she was talking about Thomas and what it meant to love something wild enough to let it go. She kept it." They buried her in Billings, beside Thomas, in early November. Emma, who was 23 now and studying wildlife biology, a choice that had not surprised anyone in the family, read at the service. She read from the small notebook Margaret had kept in the motel room in 1998, the one recording the feeding schedule, the amounts, the times. 3 a.m., 45 milliliters, 6 a.m., 50 milliliters, 9 a.m., 55 milliliters. He drank it all today without stopping, looking up at me between swallows. The gold color in his eyes. The notebook ran to 11 days. Emma read all of it. There was not a dry eye in the church. The Park Service named the wolf, officially and posthumously, with a designation that broke from their usual alphanumeric system. They called him Sullivan. It was Dr. Sandra Reeves who proposed it, in a memo that pointed out that the existing scientific literature contained nothing that adequately explained what had transpired in the Lamar Valley on October 23rd, and that in the absence of scientific explanation it seemed appropriate to record, at minimum, the name of the human whose promise had apparently been worth keeping across 25 years. The memo was approved. There are questions that science cannot answer. Not because science is insufficient, but because the questions belong to a different order of things. Why did a wild wolf, in the last days of his extraordinarily long life, remain in a particular territory rather than ranging, as old wolves sometimes do, toward the higher country? Why did he circle a camp in the night without approaching, as if taking measure of something, deciding something? Why did he come at all? The researchers who have studied the northern resident population, the documented cases of elephants returning across extraordinary distances to places of meaning, the evidence accumulating across dozens of species of something that looks, from every observable angle, like memory and grief and recognition. Those researchers would offer you their careful, qualified, fascinating framework. They would talk about olfactory memory, which in wolves is extraordinarily long-lived. They would talk about the documented capacity of wolves to recognize individual humans across extended separations. They would offer you everything they have, which is considerable and worth knowing. But the ranger who found them said something different. Dale Hutchins said it to his wife the evening after, when he was still slightly not himself, slightly displaced from the ordinary world in the way certain experiences leave you. She asked him what it looked like, what he had seen. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "It looked like two old friends who had been trying to find their way back to each other for a very long time. And they made it. Right at the end, they made it." That's all it was. That's everything it was. Think about that for a moment. Margaret Sullivan was 57 years old in a motel room in Montana when she made a promise she had no way to know she could keep. She didn't know Ghost would survive. She didn't know she would survive. She didn't know that both of them would carry their years like stones and still be standing, still be breathing, still be making their way across the distance between the human world and the wild one, right at the end. She knew only that she meant it. And she trusted that meaning something was enough to make it real, even if the keeping of it took 25 years and 300 miles and every last thing she had. If someone in your life needs to hear this story today, share it with them. Some promises are worth keeping even when they're hard. Some bonds are worth honoring even when they're inconvenient and exhausting and everyone who loves you is begging you to be sensible. Some wild things wait longer than we think possible, and maybe that's because they know something we keep forgetting, that will come back if we meant it. That the heart keeps its word even when the mind gets distracted. That love, real love, the kind that has no practical justification, is the most accurate compass there is. Margaret Sullivan knew where she was going. She had always known. She just needed 25 years to find the road. If stories like this have touched you, if you believe, the way Margaret believed, that the bonds between humans and wild animals are real and sacred and worth every impractical mile they require, subscribe to Feral Soul Stories. Join our community. We tell these stories because they deserve to be told. Because every one of them is a reminder that the most important things we ever do are the ones that don't make sense on paper. New stories every week. Real emotions. Untamed hearts.